Coach Tony, Wrestling Podium Performance, and today is the start of the 4-part mini-series on shin splints here on YouTube, or as they're commonly called, medial tibial stress syndrome. So what are shin splints? And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into in this 4-part series. So the 4 parts are going to be, first, the anatomy, so all the structures involved, the muscles, tendons, ligaments, the actual joints. As well, the second part, we dive into the causes. What is the underlying reason, or what is actually causing the pain of shin splints to manifest where they are? The third part is going to be commonly misdiagnosed medical issues that are called shin splints, but they actually aren't. And in a few of these cases, it can be quite catastrophic, leading all the way up to and including amputation, which, as you can guess, would be a worst case scenario for anybody. And finally, the fourth part of the series is going to be a bit more of like a 2-parter of its own, because we have to first look at prevention of shin splints, as well as ways to mitigate the issues involved around shin splints. So as we dive in, the first part, all about the anatomy of shin splints. All right, so now that the intro's out of the way, let's dive right into part 1, the anatomy. First thing we have to look at is, where does the name shin splints come from? It comes from the shin bone, that bone in the front of your leg below the knee that in soccer they wear shin guards to protect. But now, why is it that shin splints manifest in this bone? It's not actually that the bone itself is injured. We have to take a look at all the structures around. So let's dive into our anatomy, starting off with the bones. First, we have to start around the knee. At the knee, we have our patella. We're going to be focusing on everything from here down in this video. So the patella is our kneecap. From here, directly below that, we have our tibia, the shin bone. But right behind that is a smaller bone called the fibula. Now, a way to liken this is take a look at your forearm. There's actually 2 bones in your forearm. Well, in our lower leg, it's very similar to that. There's 2 bones there. The difference is they don't move quite as much. And because of this lack of movement, it's quite stable down there. Now, these 2 bones actually attach at our ankle with an articulation to what's called the calcaneus, which is that big bone at the back of our foot that is our heel. From here in front, you have your tarsals, and then in front of that is your metatarsals, the moving parts of your toes. So now that we know what bones are going to be involved, we have to know and take a look at all of our muscles. We're not going to go deep diving into this like an anatomy text. We're going to cover the main players. So directly outside of your, to the outside of your tibia, the shin bone, is the tibialis anterior. Literally what its name means is in front, anterior, and tibialis, right by the tibia. This muscle's entire job is lifting your foot and your toes up and letting them go back down. At the back of our lower leg, we have the calf, made up of 2 primary muscles. The soleus, which is actually sits for the most part underneath the big muscle that we see, which is our gastrocnemius. That's the one that, when it's very well developed, you can see a bit of a split in it. The soleus, you don't really get to see quite as much. These 2, when they're extremely powerful, as we know, they can handle a lot of work, but if they're over powerful compared to the anterior tibialis, this can cause a weak link and a structural imbalance. A structural imbalance can then lead to an injury, which shin splints would be the injury that can be manifesting. From here, we look a little bit deeper inside of the actual lower leg. We have several other muscles in here. Their names are quite simple to remember, because for the most part, it's just either tibialis or fibularis, anterior and posterior. So all that means is in front or behind that bone. So these muscles can be, if it's anterior, its primary job is going to be assisting your anterior tibialis in lifting the foot up. And if it's behind, its job is going to be either stability, keeping the bones in place, or assisting the calf in lifting your heel up. Now, going down below, we have our plantar fascia. That's at the bottom of our foot. If you take a look at the bottom of your foot right now, you have an arch in your foot. The arch in your foot, the membrane that covers it, is the plantar fascia. If you actually curl up your toes too hard, you can feel this spasm and cramp up. That is your plantar fascia spasm. So from here, there's also smaller muscles involved in your actual movement of the toes, but we're not going to really get into that because they're not as crucial for the purposes of shin splints. They have a very small role, but it's pretty much negligible because those muscles, for the most part, only attach around your ankle, whereas your actual tibialis anterior attaches at the top of your foot and has a bit of a role in pulling your toes up as well in a synergistic relationship with the digitorums down there. Now that we've gone through simple anatomy of the muscles, now we have to think about, okay, what are muscles attaching to the bone with? Tendons. The big tendons we got to keep in mind here is, one, at the top of the tibia is our patellar tendon. So this is actually an offshoot of your quadriceps tendon. So your quadriceps actually comes down to your knee, it attaches, but that tendon actually becomes your quadriceps tendon, and it actually goes over the front of your patella, and at the bottom of it, it becomes the patellar tendon and attaches to your tibia. And its job is to help pull up your lower leg, to straighten out your leg. At the bottom of your foot, you have your anterior tibialis tendon. As its name implies, anterior tibialis, it attaches to your foot. Like I said before, it pulls the foot up. The back of your leg, we have our Achilles tendon. That's that big, massive tendon on the back of your leg from your calf to your heel. Its job is to keep everything attached so that you can actually lift up your heels. But just like with your quadriceps tendon to the patella, this actually comes around and actually wraps up underneath and becomes part of your plantar fascia. Now, this can lead and actually cause a little bit of the issues with the shin splints, which I'm going to cover in part 2. From here, we now have to take a look at the last big piece of the puzzle in terms of anatomy, some of the ligaments. First, let's take a look at the knee. There's 4 primary ligaments in the knee. We have your ACL and PCL, so anterior and posterior cruciate ligament, and then we have your LCL and MCL, being the medial and lateral collateral ligaments. So a lot of people in sport hear about one or several of these either being sprained or torn, and that reduces the stability in the knee joint. Between the fibula and your tibia, there are a couple of ligaments in there that actually keep things connected. We're not really going to dive into those too much because they don't have much role to play in here. All you need to really know is that the ligament here keeps those 2 bones somewhat stable together with one another so that there's not too much of a rotation force in the bottom of your leg. It's not like with your wrist where you can turn your wrist over. With your ankle, you can't really turn your foot all the way up like you can with your forearm and your wrist. The reason for this, the lower leg, your leg in general, needs a lot more stability than your upper body. Part 2 in our mini-series on overcoming and defeating shin splints, the causes. But before we do so, remember to hit that like button below and subscribe to the channel. So the first major cause of shin splints is a sudden increase in either training volume, frequency, intensity, or a change in the training cycle. So we actually have to take a look at that last one first because it influences everything else. When we change the training cycle, a lot of times we're either going to be increasing the frequency and volume with that, or the intensity in our running, the speed at which we are doing it, or we are actually going to be increasing both at the same time while changing surfaces. So why is it that the surface is so important for shin splints and for lower leg injuries to begin with? One, the softer the surface is, the actual less impact is going to be on the body. Just think if you're out walking on the sand of the beach or you're walking on wet grass, it feels soft, it feels nice. It doesn't feel like you're pounding. Whereas if you're running on concrete or asphalt, which a lot of runners do, or on a running track, like track athletes do, it's a lot harder. So there's a lot more return in energy coming back from that surface. This energy return is what allows people to run fast on these surfaces. So track athletes run so much faster on a track than they do on a dirt path because the track itself is returning energy from the rubber that makes up the track, as well as the concrete or asphalt that the track is laid on top of. Now, why is frequency and training volume going to be so important together? Because anytime you increase the frequency, you increase the volume that you are running. when we increase the volume, that's a lot more stress and demand placed upon the body. And now, why is intensity important? The faster you run, the more force that's applied with each step. And when you apply more force with each step, that's a greater demand on the body. That's why we don't recommend for people to just get right up off their couch and go out and run a marathon, because that demand on the body is going to put them at a greater risk for injury. All right, so this leads us directly into our second major cause of shin splints, a lack of recovery or period of adaptation for the tissues to be able to handle the training demands placed upon them. One of the ways we can somewhat get around this is by incorporating intentional rest days or intentionally having days of less volume or frequency, so that the tissues can still get a stimulus but not be having such a high demand placed upon them. If we don't have enough rest in between either training days or training runs within a session, if we're doing multiple runs in a session, we're placing stresses on the body that it can't necessarily handle, and it takes a period of adaptation to work up to handling those stresses. Another major place of concern is crash dieting and hypocaloric diets and inadequate protein intakes. This is even more common within female athletes, mainly because of male coaches, which is the dominant demographic in coaching, are men, putting undue focus on strictly the scale weight. Yes, your body weight is going to influence how well you can run. Just think, throw a 20-pound weight vest on and run with it. Take the weight vest off, it's a lot easier to run without it. That's the same type of thing. Oh, if you just weigh less, it's easier. But a lot of times this hypocaloric diet and crash diet that a lot of female athletes end up putting themselves through because of their coach causes a double-edged sword effect here. They're harming themselves to try to get a performance, but they're not actually going to get that performance because they're focusing on the wrong things. They're not recovering. They're not getting enough protein. If you're not getting enough protein, your muscles and bodily functions cannot recover. That is the macronutrient for recovery and tissue regeneration. Without enough of that, you're not going to recover optimally or at all. So one thing we should be focusing on there, especially for athletes or anybody wanting to be active, you want to be getting 1 gram of dietary protein per pound of body weight, or 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. One of the other things to look at in terms of recovery is whenever an issue starts to pop up, getting it taken care of right away, whether that's getting proper and competent therapeutics for it. I'm talking proper massage therapy, athletic therapy, proper stretching, getting proper chiropractic work done. This is only going to help enhance your ability to recover. These professionals, especially the really competent and excellent ones, are going to make your body's ability to recover go to a whole other level. They're going to put you in a situation for success. Now, our third big reason why we end up with shin splints is the anatomy itself. A lot of people end up with a little bit of between their tibia and the fibula. They don't really have any give between the two. It's very tight in that region. All the little muscles and tendons down there are lacking range of motion. Now, I'm not trying to make you think that your lower leg should be able to turn like your wrist does. That would not be right. But there should be a little bit of give down there still, so that the body can still have that give and take within itself. And then if our tendons are a little too tight, especially our Achilles tendon and our tibialis anterior tendon, we're not able to get proper dorsiflexion in our ankle, so we're restricting ourselves. Anytime we have a restriction somewhere, it means that we're most likely running the risk for something going wrong down the road. If our ankles are tight, that means something isn't right. That's a quick way to look at it. Just think, if you're unable to get proper dorsiflexion and movement in the ankle, the knee, and tibia and fibula area, all that stress that's going through there has to go somewhere. And a lot of times it gets taken up by our muscles. That's why we feel tight. But that stress over time causes a chronic issue. So this leads us directly into our fourth major cause of shin splints, chronic inflammation. So a lot of times chronic inflammation is going to be excess fluid in an area. In this case, it's going to be excess fluid buildup in the anterior compartment of the lower leg, right where the anterior tibialis muscle is. All this extra fluid will push down onto the nerve, cause pain, and our body sends a signal then, which creates a run-on effect. If we're not getting this inflammation taken care of, we run the risk of a chronic issue like shin splints. And now let's take a look at our fifth major cause for shin splints, a relatively weak tibialis anterior muscle. What do I mean by relatively weak? You're never going to get an anterior tibialis muscle that has a very strong or a very high magnitude of 1 repetition maximum. It's not going to be able to lift a lot of weight. The muscle is quite small to begin with, and its job is literally just to lift up your foot. But when I'm talking about relatively strong, I'm also talking strength endurance, and that's what's going to be a major determinant in the health of your tibialis anterior. If your calf is extremely powerful, your quad is extremely powerful, that's going to be putting a lot of extra stress onto the anterior tibialis if it can't handle those loads that are placed upon it by muscles that are projecting your body through space at greater distances and frequencies. So your calf, your quad, and your glute are going to make you run faster, but if your tibialis anterior can't lift up your foot fast enough, so the rate firing of it isn't going to be all that great, and it can't do it enough times fast enough, you're going to run into an injury risk. That becomes the weak link. Weak links is where things break down. So while yes, maximal strength will play a role, you can work on increasing the 1 RM, 3 RM, 5 RM, 10 RM of the tibialis anterior muscle. Strength endurance in this area is going to be a little bit more important. Now there's special considerations to be made for kicking sports, soccer, football, rugby, American football. Whenever you're kicking an object, you get a slight hyper extension of the foot. So as you make contact with the ball, or if you're doing kickboxing, mixed martial arts, you make contact with your opponent's skull, the foot is actually going to bend slightly further backwards. This causes excess, not necessarily flexibility that's natural, but a very short period of time where you get the muscle to overstretch and the tendon to overstretch and then rebound back. If you're not able to handle the stress of that, you're going to run the risk of an injury again because the tissues there end up being pulled apart a little too far. And if you're doing this frequently and not able to actually handle it and get the muscle fibers to come back together properly, that's when you end up with a chronic issue. That's why so many soccer players end up with shin splints. They're constantly in a toe point position when they're dribbling the ball, kicking the ball around, and then when they kick it hard, the foot gets wrenched right back. And then you add in that they're doing a lot of running. That's a lot of stress placed upon there, and they haven't learned how to run properly. And in a lot of cases, they're never actually strengthening up this area. Their calf, quad, glute are getting very strong from the running and kicking, but the tibialis anterior gets neglected, which is why specific work is needed. So tibialis anterior raises, whether it's with a dumbbell between your feet, a cable attached, you're just focusing on doing some heel walks, all of these are going to add up and help improve the health of the lower leg. And now we have to take a look at footwear. Old broken footwear is one of the big causes of shin splints. What I mean by this is take a look at your shoe. For example, my shoe here is a Nike Pegasus running shoe. So when you take a look at the sole of your shoe, it shouldn't have all kinds of wrinkles, creases, and breaks in it. If it does, we're literally talking about a shoe that is dead or broken down. That means it's no longer actually going to support you properly when you're running, and you're going to be taking a lot of extra force through your foot, which then has to travel upstream from there. When we're also taking a look at footwear, there's this craze of minimalist shoes. If you're doing a lot of your running on hard tracks, asphalt, and concrete, you should not be running in minimalist shoes because they offer zero protection between you and the surface you are on. Now, you're going to hear proponents for these shoes say, oh, but it's healthier, it's more natural to run like this. Go ahead and try it. You run the risk of greater increase in calcaneus fractures, your heel. You run the risk of metatarsal and tarsal fractures and injuries. because it's not natural to be running on concrete and asphalt. So we're running on something unnatural, but you want to run much more naturally. The vast majority of people to begin with, when they're running, are a little bit overweight. So that's a lot of extra force coming back at you. And because these surfaces have no give whatsoever for the human body, that's a lot of extra force being returned into the human body. And this goes first through the foot, which is why a lot of issues end up happening there, and then through the lower leg. Shin splints happen because things start to add up upstream, all this extra volume and intensity as well as shock coming through there causes issues because we're going to end up with an increase in the amount of inflammation as well from running on these surfaces. And then something I've noticed and others have also noticed is that those who have issues with plantar fasciitis seem to have an issue with an increased rate of shin splints as well. It's almost like everything's a little bit interconnected within parts of our body. If you've got an issue with the knee, ankle, or hip ends up having something go on. If there's something going on with your hamstring, well, there's something else. So in this case, when the plantar fascia is acting up and you have plantar fasciitis, whether it's just from some inflammation or there's actually a real bad long-term issue there, something else has to pick up the slack, and that a lot of times ends up being the tibialis anterior, because our calf can handle quite a bit, as well as our Achilles tendon. They're workhorses of the body, but the tibialis anterior can't, so then we end up with inflammation, and we end up with that chain of events. Inflammation leads to fluid, fluid leads to pressure, pressure leads to shin splints. So these are our major causes of shin splints. As you can see, one can lead right into the other, and it's a knock-on effect. Whereas sometimes we can take a look and nip the issue in the bud early on, or if an issue pops up later on, we just have to take a look at, okay, what's being done and how can we rectify the situation? Is it simple therapy? Is it a little bit of rest that we need? Commonly misdiagnosed medical issues that are diagnosed as shin splints, but actually aren't. The first one we're going to go into is compartment syndrome. So this is, as the name suggests, has to do with the anterior compartment of the lower leg, where the anterior tibialis muscle is actually located. So as the name suggests, it has to do with pressure in that compartment. So if there's an increase or a chronic excess pressure here, you end up with shin splints. The issue with it is that it gets called shin splints because in compartment syndrome, the pain manifests in the same place, along the same, and it also has a lot of the same symptoms as well. So what we can take a look at when it comes to compartment syndrome are the 5 Ps. We have pain, pallor, pulselessness, paresthesia, and paralysis. So pallor is just a loss of color. Paresthesia is that numbing feeling that you get. Pulselessness, that's when, not necessarily that there's no blood flow coming in, but that is very hard to find the pulse in the area. And finally, paralysis, which is loss of function. This is the worst of all of them. So each of these can actually be present not just in the anterior compartment or in the front of the leg, but it can also manifest all the way down through your foot. The second big thing to take a look at when it comes to compartment syndrome is sometimes it can be simply rectified just with some physiotherapy, good manual therapy, and rest. The issue is the longer it goes misdiagnosed, the more severe it becomes. Just think about any medical issue. The longer it goes without being treated, the worse outcome that can happen. And the actual worst outcome here that typically happens is that you can actually require amputation. One of the fastest and easiest ways to rectify compartment syndrome is with a surgical intervention. Now, it's not excessively invasive. A lot of times it just requires an incision to allow some of that pressure out. The recovery time can be anywhere from a couple of weeks to maybe a month or two, which is a lot less time than is required for, say, amputation, which you never truly fully recover from. The second medical issue that's commonly diagnosed as a shin splint, but really isn't, is stress fractures. These seem to be becoming much more common today, particularly in female athletes being diagnosed with shin splints or stress fractures. A lot of times a stress fracture gets diagnosed after a bone scan. One of the easy tests that you can actually do for this, as weird as it sounds, is utilizing a tuning fork that someone who would tune a piano, for example, and putting it right at the base of your heel or along the bone, hammering it with not like your regular industrial hammer or sledgehammer, but just with a tuning hammer, a small little, basically you could even use a spoon. You just hit it, cause the vibration, and if there's some severe pain that all of a sudden happens in the bone, there's a good chance that you may have a stress fracture. One of the biggest causes of stress fractures is doing far too much volume for too long of a time without adequate recovery time and inadequate digestive intake. So you're not eating enough to recover, you're not taking enough time to recover, and you're doing too much work. The reason I said before that it's becoming increasingly common and even more common among female athletes is, as I covered in a previous video, male coaches putting too much of a focus on the scale number as opposed to body composition or performance, other key performance indicators for the athlete. So they run them into the ground, put them on a hard restrictive diet, and then 2-3 months later, we wonder why the female athlete is injured. So stress fractures, I'll typically blame a coach for a stress fracture. Our third misdiagnosis is thrombosis. So this is typically clotting of arteries or veins, blood vessels, a little deeper down. And it can be pretty hard to actually detect. You actually have to go and get a medical professional, a doctor, radiology. You need to get imaging done to actually take a look and see if there is clotting going on. And the reason this can be so catastrophic is anytime you have clotting, you run the risk of strokes and heart attacks, any kind of cardiac issues start to arise from this. Causes of thrombosis are multifactorial. It can be simply just genetic, it can be dietary, it can be lifestyle, it could be a previous injury that you've had where you've had a severe trauma or an impact to the lower leg, for example. And although everything seemed fine, something was pinched off in there either due to scar tissue formation or just the impact itself caused something not to quite work as well. That's why thrombosis can be quite an issue. And when that clot lasts for too long and then all of a sudden your pulse launches that clot upwards, that's when it can lead into a stroke, it can lead into other medical issues, all the way up to and including, sorry to say, a loss of life due to thrombosis. That's why getting the proper diagnosis is so critical. And our final misdiagnosed medical issue that can occur and be called a shin splint, while exceptionally rare, there are certain forms of malignant tumors or cancers that can form on bones. So if you notice that there's a malformation of the bone, like there's this weird bump on the bone that just never seems to go away, it's soft, the bone doesn't really have the same strength that it used to have, you're prone to pain, any kind of like impact really hurts, it would be a good idea to get checked. I'm not saying all of these to be alarmist about shin splints. The reason for this specific video is I've had several athletes in the past who have been told by their physios, whether it was at school or otherwise, that, oh, you just have shin splints. And it turned out that it was, in one person's case, it was thrombosis that they had from a car accident when they were younger. Potentially, I can't actually say for sure. And another two were they actually had compartment syndrome that was becoming increasingly more severe. One of them now plays professional soccer football in Europe, whereas when the person was still in university, a lot of times was regulated to having to lose time on the field because of pain. So getting the proper diagnosis, if you are an athlete, can help you get back on the field to play faster, it can help you advance to that next level, and it can help you to get paid more to play the sport that you love, whether it's soccer, football, American football, rugby, track and field. Getting the proper diagnosis allows you to get treatment faster, allows you to get return to play faster, and cuts down on time lost. And in some cases, when you become a professional, or if you are a professional athlete, you're no longer losing money doing the sport that you love. 4 in our mini-series on beating shin splints. And today is going to be about ways to mitigate, and if you have shin splints, ways to reduce or even rehab it. The first thing we have to take a look at is planned rest days. Now, why do I say planned rest days? If we have an injury or we're leading into an injury, one of the biggest issues is we're doing too much volume or we're having too much intensity too soon, which means we actually have to take a step back and allow the tissue to adapt to the stresses we're placing upon it. So one way of doing this is either planned rest days, or we take alternating days where one day we might be running and the other day, instead of running and putting that type of beating on the lower leg, especially this time of year when a lot of people lace up their shoes, get outside and they're running on asphalt and concrete, the hardest surfaces possible. And if we think back to the second video on shin splints where I talked about causes, one of the issues was hard surfaces. That energy that's returned goes right into your foot and your lower leg first. So if we're running on these surfaces and we haven't done much of that throughout the winter, we need more time to acclimate, to adapt to being able to handle that. So by reducing the amount of actual running on these surfaces by cycling, great time of year in North America, Europe, as we're getting into spring. Today, for example, sunny, about 20 degrees Celsius or 70 Fahrenheit. You're able to get outside. It's much more approachable to be outside to exercise, which means hard surfaces. You're not really going to be out on the grass. So if you're doing alternating days of your volume being running and then cycling, you're allowing your lower leg to actually recover from the pounding of running. It might seem weird. I said rest day. You're allowing those tissues to rest and recover without that pounding on them. And then we have to take a look at the amount of volume that we're doing. One way I like to look at things is we should plan how we're going to do our running. If you're doing it for speed, like you're an athlete, you're a sprinter, okay, you're going to be doing more lactate threshold work. That might be, for example, 10 times 200 meters. Well, from week to week, you want to look, or session to session, you want to be looking at increasing that by 5 to 10%. So that might be adding one more run. So you do this for about 4 weeks or 6 sessions, and then that final week, you cut the volume by 33 to 50%, and it allows you to still get the stimulus of the run, but you're not doing as much volume, so you're actually getting a little bit of extra recovery because you've improved your work capacity, you've improved your fitness to the point where it's used to being able to do 10, 11, 12, 13 runs. But now you're only going to be doing 5 to 7 runs, for example. Well, now you have that extra little reserve for recovery. If you're doing distance runs, say you're doing 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, well, or you're running for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. You just add a couple extra minutes or you add a couple hundred extra meters in the same fashion, 5 to 10%, and that final week, you cut it right down. And again, it allows you to get that stimulus, but also the recovery. You can also alternate days with the cycling here as well. Or you can do half the session where you're doing the running, and then if you still want that aerobic fitness to come in, and the health impacts of that, you do the other half cycling so that you're not getting as much of a beating, especially on hard surfaces, as you would otherwise. Another thing to look at is the intensity that we're going to be running at. For example, you don't want to go from doing nothing to going out and running full out sprint or running 10K. It would kind of, the weight room equivalent to that would be like going into the gym for the first time and doing 1 RM on the bench press. Your elbows and shoulders and muscles are going to hate you. Not to mention, you run the risk of an injury because you're not accustomed to lifting heavy. Well, in this case, you're not accustomed, you're not acclimated or adapted to running fast for a long time. So we got to work up to that by increasing the intensity week to week type of thing. Now, there's an inverse in intensity and volume. As the intensity increases, the volume typically drops off. But one way where we can keep the volume the same is we take a look at our pace. So if you're doing the 10 times 200 meter example, first time you're doing it in 10 times 200 meters in 40 seconds, well, the next time you look at trying to do all of them in 39 seconds and under, then 38 seconds and under. And then on that rest and recover week, you're still doing them in the 3rd or the 4th week's intensity level, so 35, 36 seconds, but you're only doing like 5 to 7 of them. Whereas if you're doing distance running, okay, instead of doing a 7-minute mile, a 5-minute mile for elite people, you're just not going to be doing that for 4 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, for example. You're going to do that for, okay, 3 miles, 5 kilometers. You're cutting the volume way down. It allows you to recover and get more adapted to being able to handle that kind of stresses on the lower leg. And then, as I mentioned, the inverse relationship between volume and intensity. So a lot of times, as you increase the speed you're going to be going at, you're going to decrease the overall volume. So days where you're doing a faster run, you're going to decrease how far you're running. Why is this? Because each stride that you take, every step, when you go faster, you're applying a lot more force. Well, that has to go through one place. And if it's not adapting to it, you're running the risk for shin splints. That's usually one of the first running injuries that happens this time of year. Shin splints and ankle issues usually pop up right about now because it takes a little bit of time for your tibialis anterior and your lower leg to get acclimated and accustomed to running with higher intensity and higher volume. So by programming things a little more intelligently, you're setting yourself up for success. Another thing to look at in terms of improving or mitigating shin splints is stretching and improving the range of motion. This gets overlooked a lot, and I harp on flexibility for one big reason with stretching in the lower leg. A lot of people are inflexible. They're stiff as a goddamn board, especially in their Achilles. They have very poor dorsiflexion. Well, if we're taking a look, a lot of times when we talk shin splints, we're typically talking about the front of the lower leg. But in this case, I'm talking about stretching the calf and the Achilles complex. Since how that's the antagonist of the tibialis anterior and lifting up your foot, a lot of times your calf, Achilles is really tight. A lot of people lack the dorsiflexion to be able to actually get the foot to come up. So if we improve the flexibility here, it helps with another thing. In order for our body to recover, it needs nutrients. The only way that nutrients happen is blood flow. Well, by stretching, we're actually encouraging blood flow into that area. We're somewhat coaxing the body without punishing it, although let's be honest, stretching can feel like punishment. We're coaxing the body to send more blood into that area. As we open up the range of motion, we reduce an inhibitory complex that our body naturally puts in when we're not flexible that prevents us from having proper function. If your ankle, instead of it being able to come up and go down properly, it only moves a few degrees each way, you're setting yourself up for an injury right there. If we don't have good range of motion in our ankle, we're not going to be able to efficiently move. When we don't efficiently move, it's kind of like the weak link in a chain. Eventually, something's going to go pop, whether that's a shin splint happening or something else, just some other structure failing, and then you're injured. We want to mitigate the risk for injury as much as we can. Another way we can improve our flexibility with stretching and even not stretching is just by taking different hardnesses and sizes of balls and rolling the sole of our foot. Why? It helps to relax your plantar fascia and your actual foot. It gives yourself like a self-massage. You start out with like a tennis ball. You can use a thero ball. You can also work your way up through lacrosse balls, softballs, baseballs, all the way through to a golf ball. Now, a smaller hard ball is going to be much more focused point. It's going to be a little more painful in the beginning. That's why we work up to it with the softer ball working into the harder ball. And the other thing this will help to do is, again, get some more blood flow in there. Blood flow helps as well for recovery. When we get nutrients in, recovery happens. If we aren't getting proper blood flow into these structures, they're not going to be able to recover as well. That's why it's so important. Something else that can help with flexibility, range of motion, and recovery is getting a massage, some good manual therapy from a chiropractor, physiotherapist, athletic therapist. Why? Well, we take our cars into the mechanic to get work done. Why don't we do that with our bodies? Just think about your body as a Formula One car, or even a Honda Civic. Well, you still take it to get the wheels rotated, you still take it for an oil change. Well, we should do that with our body as well, so that someone who is a professional in taking care of the body is able to point things out or even fix certain little ailments we might have, things we might not notice, and then all of a sudden, because they're working with their hands all the time, they palpate and notice something that's either a little tight, not moving properly, and then they're able to, through different modalities, whether it's ART, massage, Graston, they're able to work things out. They're able to reduce an adhesion. They're able to get something that might feel like it's a little locked up to all of a sudden release. And then next thing you know, your recovery, your ability to actually move more efficiently improves much quicker than you'd be able to do otherwise. Yes, it is an investment, but one of the best things we can do is invest in ourselves and our body so that it functions better and is healthier. So these are a few of the biggest ways that we can mitigate and even rehabilitate some of the shin splint issues that pop up, especially this time of year. Is part 5, the finale of our series on defeating shin splints. Today we're going to be looking at how to train in the weight room and nutritional considerations to defeat shin splints once and for all. So first we have to remember back to the video on the anatomy when we're talking about strength training and take a look at the lower leg. We have the anterior and posterior, basically the front and back. On the back of the lower leg, we have the big old calf muscle, and then on the front, we have your tibialis anterior. When we look at strength training, we have to remember there's always going to be a little bit of an imbalance anywhere in our body, but we want to minimize these imbalances as best we can. In the lower leg, that imbalance is going to be the greatest pretty much anywhere in the body, just because of the muscle mass involved. The calf is much bigger than your tibialis anterior. Just your Achilles tendon is basically the same size as the tibialis anterior, just so that you get the picture here. Remember, the calf's job is to lift your heel off the ground, whereas the tib ant's job is to lift the forefoot or to pull your toes up off the ground. So while I've just reviewed a little bit of the anatomy, we also have to take a look at what is the function or action involved and why is there going to be an imbalance? One reason why there's this massive imbalance is your calf is lifting up basically your entire body weight, so it needs to be much bigger. Whereas the tib ant is only lifting up the weight of your foot, very little. But because as we're training, as we're running, walking and whatnot, the repetitive stress of lifting up your foot for every step is what ends up leading to an overuse injury that then leads into shin splint. Now, when we're talking about training specifically, a lot of times when we go to the gym, we're going to either intentionally train the calves, or if we're running, we unintentionally train the calves. What do I mean by this? At the gym, you go, you do your standing or your seated calf raises, so you're specifically targeting the calves. When you're running, every time you run, every time you toe off, basically you launch yourself into the air with each step, you're training the calf explosively in a way here. But we very rarely train the tibialis anterior. It's one of the most neglected muscle groups in the body. Now, there's zealots out there who are going to tell you all you have to do is do tib ant raises and it's going to cure all of your issues. That's a load of hogwash. It doesn't. But we can minimize the risk of tibialis anterior injuries, or in this case, shin splints specifically, by directly training the tib anterior specifically. How do we do that? Well, remember, the job of it is to just lift up the forefoot, lift up your toes off the ground. There is a device that is actually made, but is very rarely seen in commercial and even private studios, because not many gym owners are going to spend $400 to $1,000 on a piece of equipment that's very specific to a muscle group that is very massively neglected and has only one use. So as you can see here, it's made, this one is the Atlantis model, for example, and all you do is you slide your foot in and you lift your toes up. Literally the only thing that you do here. That's one of the reasons why it's very rarely purchased by a lot of gym owners and by commercial gyms. It takes up space, it usually just collects dust. Without this device, how can we train the tib anterior directly and efficiently? One of the easiest ways to do it is do some heel walks. But what are heel walks? It's literally just walking around on your heels with your toes pulled up off the ground. You're not going to be taking the same size steps that you'd normally take. You're going to take fairly short steps. I would suggest you start out by walking 25 meters at a time, roughly 30 seconds, and you work up to doing this for, say, 100 meters or about 2 minutes. One of the issues you're going to run into with this is because you're in a static isometric hold of keeping everything in place with your toes off the ground, you're going to get a burning sensation fairly quickly and it's going to become difficult. Not to mention, let's be honest, if you walk around like this for a long duration of time, you're going to look and feel stupid. We don't want you to be doing that for long periods of time. We want it to be specific for a goal of reducing the risk of shin splints, improving the strength and endurance of the tibialis anterior. So that's why I say 25 meters, 30 seconds, 100, working up to 100 meters or about 2 minutes. As you go over this type of distance, you do you do multiple repetitions of it, do sets of it. You could do it a couple times a day, and you're going to increase the strength and endurance of the muscle. What this then allows you to do is every time you're pulling the toes up off the ground, you're a little bit more efficient at it. Not to mention that in that shortened range, the muscle itself is going to be specifically stronger there. And a lot of people end up over time losing some of the strength in that end range, in the fully contracted position of the tibialis anterior. Just think, sit there and pull your toes up off the ground and hold it for 10 seconds. Just really try to pull them up as hard as you can. You're already going to start to feel a burning sensation there, and that's just a short little time period. Now, going back into the gym specifically, I would always recommend anywhere from 8 to 15 repetitions. I've personally found to be the most effective for athletes and non-athletes alike in terms of the rep range that is going to be best for improving the strength and strength endurance of the tibialis anterior. And for those who already have had shin splints, it has reduced the severity and even eliminated them in as little as, I'm not even kidding, in 2015, it helped to reduce and eliminate the shin splints of one soccer player in 2 weeks. So just by strengthening them up in such a short period of time, and this was once a week, boom, you start to have instant gains in this area because it's so chronically undertrained. As I mentioned before, there was that specific machine that you can get. You honestly don't need it. Another easy way that you can actually do tibialis anterior raises, which is the exercise name of any time you're specifically training that muscle, you can literally sit on a bench with your legs hanging off the edge, hold a dumbbell between your feet, and just pull the dumbbell up. Just fight gravity in this way. Do 8 to 15 reps. You can start at the lower end with a relatively light dumbbell, and you can work up to heavy dumbbells. The thing is, with the tibialis anterior, because of the function of the muscle, you do not actually want to be aiming for 1 repetition maxes with it. It doesn't serve a real purpose. What serves a purpose is working in that functional hypertrophy, and strength endurance ranges. So 8 plus reps up to 15. I've personally found anytime you start to go above 15, you don't really get much from it. You're just kind of going through the motions. What are some other ways that we can specifically and directly train in this way? Well, there are specialized curl bars, or even a tibialis anterior bar that's now being made. I think Rogue makes one of them, where your heels are on the bottom rung of the bar and your toes are up underneath the top bar, so that your kind of heel is on one, toes are on the other. This way, when you pull up, you're pulling the resistance up. Further away from your ankle that the weight is held, the harder the exercise is actually going to be, so less resistance or less added load is going to be needed. So Watson also makes, I believe it's just called their power curl bar. You can see it here, and that bar is much cheaper than a lot of the tibialis anterior devices, and it allows you to be able to actually have a little bit better variability in the exercise. You can do it from different angles. Another way that you can do it is you can also be standing up straight, just like I am right now, and you can be just lifting your toes up off the ground. You can have heavier dumbbells where you resist against an isometric, or lighter dumbbells where you lift them up, or you can even do this underneath a barbell, for example, lifting it up. Something else you can do is, like where I am right now, my squat rack has a built-in twin pulley system. You can get a foot strap where you just strap it around your forefoot, so around just below where your toes are, and you can be sitting on the ground, sitting on a bench, or even standing up, and from different angles you can be doing the tibialis anterior raises, where the resistance itself is actually being directed by the pulley, so you're still fighting gravity, you've just redirected it. What this does with the different angles and the different standing seated positions is it changes where in the actual exercise is going to be the hardest. So you're training the full strength curve of the exercise. So if you're sitting with your leg straight out in front of you, the hardest point in that exercise is actually going to be the end ranges. Whereas if you're standing, the hardest point is going to be the mid-range, just because of where the hardest points in the movement from a physics point of view, where gravity has the most impact, is going to be. So in terms of the number of sets to do, Always start out somewhat at like, say 2 sets in the gym of this. Work your way up to 3, maybe 4 sets when you're doing it. You only really need to do this once a week. More than that typically gets a little hard to recover from. It might seem a little weird, but remember, every time you walk, you're using the muscle. Every time you run, you're using that muscle. So by directly training it with strength training once a week, you're giving it adequate stimulus, and I would keep the rest for this at 45 to 60 seconds. You don't really need a lot of rest, but if you start to go below 45-second rest, you're usually not going to be adequately recovered. If you're a distance runner type of person, you can get away with a little less rest, but we want it to be the most effective. So take a little bit extra rest, that 45 to 60-second rest area, so that you can have the same quality of exercise, and so that every repetition is done with intent and with execution being at the highest quality. All right, so now I'm actually going to hop into footwear as a second point here. This might piss a few people off, but I really don't care. I'm being honest with this. First, let's take a look at your footwear. If you take a look at the sole of your shoe, for example, if you're taking a look around here and you notice that it's all kinds of broken down, there's creases in it. It looks like a 200-year-old piece of leather that's been folded and broken a whole bunch of times. You need new shoes, plain and simple. Take a look at the bottom of your shoe. If there's no tread left, it's time for new shoes. The reason I'm saying this is it literally means that the shoe has broken down. It's no longer actually providing the proper support that it was designed for, or in terms of when you're running on harder surfaces, cushioning. Which, talking about harder surface running, there's this big push in the fitness industry these days for wearing minimalist shoes. This is where I'm probably going to piss off some of those zealots, because minimalist shoes, when running on concrete and asphalt, road running, and even on hard tracks like Mondo, is one of the dumbest things you can do for the health of your lower leg. Why do I say that it's one of the dumbest things? Because these shoes provide zero protection. You won't see Mike Tyson, Tyson Fury, Lennox Lewis, Floyd Mayweather, you won't see boxers go and punch a steel I-beam without boxing gloves on. Why? That glove protects the hand. The whole reason why boxers wear gloves is actually to protect their hand. It's not to protect the opponent, it's to protect their own hand from breaking. Because that impact, when they're punching somebody, the rest of the hand is still somewhat moving forward, which causes forces. Well, think about every running stride you do in a way like throwing a punch, but instead you're throwing that punch into the ground with your foot. So if you don't have any protection and you're running on a very hard surface, that's a lot of energy return coming back into your foot. So when it comes to minimalist shoes and running, stop listening to your guru and the BS that they're trying to sell you while they sell you the Vivo or the Vibram newest model shoe that has no heel drop. We're looking at making you perform better and reduce injury risk. I don't care about anything else when we're talking about that. I care about making it so that you reduce your risk for injury. With shin splints, when you're returning a lot more force into the body and that muscle isn't able to support that added force and energy coming back, you're running a greater risk for injury. We humans have been wearing shoes for roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years, according to anthropological records. The main reason we started wearing shoes was to protect our feet from the elements and from wildlife pests like snakes, scorpions, and spiders that could bite us, and if they're venomous, end up killing us. All right, the next thing that we're going to be taking a look at now is our nutritional considerations. And number one of this is hydration status. A simple test you can do for this is the next time you go to the bathroom, take a look at the color. If it's a dark amber, a very dark yellow, or you haven't gone pee at all today, you're dehydrated. You need to drink more water. Yes, I understand hydration is more than just water in. But let's keep it simple right now. Most people don't drink enough water to begin with. And if a muscle is dehydrated, the risk for injury to that muscle is greatly increased. That's why most injuries for a lot of muscles happen when an athlete is in a dehydrated state. The muscle is less resilient. Now, the second big thing we're going to take a look at in terms of nutrition is your actual dietary intake. Are you eating enough to stay healthy? A lot of athletes and people in general that I come across do not consume adequate protein, and I'm speaking specifically in terms of female athletes here, a lot of them simply don't eat enough to recover. They're put on hypocaloric diets by coaches who mean well. I put that in quotations because it's more for their own ego than the athlete themselves. And it puts the athlete in an impossible position to be able to recover. So you have to take a look. Are you getting enough protein? First thing to look at, a bare minimum 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 0.75 grams per pound of body weight. I would actually say move that up, especially if you're active and you're an athlete, to 2.2 grams per kilo, 1 gram per pound of body weight. So if you're 150 pounds, you get 150 grams of protein. If you're 200 pounds, 200 grams of protein per day. Split it up over the course of the day so that it's easier to take in. As soon as you're done training or exercising, get a shake of protein into you. If you're looking for a protein shake, take a look at ATP Labs. I have a code with them, Wrestling10, gets you 10% off. And then in terms of overall caloric intake, as I was saying, a lot of females don't consume enough. If you notice that you're lethargic, as in a little bit tired, you're not recovering, you're sore longer than you should be, eat. I'm telling you right now, go eat a high protein meal that also has carbs and fats in it. Make it simple. Chicken, rice, broccoli. Make sure that you're not trying to cut all the fat off the chicken. Actually, go have a steak or a burger even. Why? You're gonna get some good fat in there. You're gonna get a good high caloric intake, especially if you're doing this post-exercise and your body's demanding those nutrients to be able to recover. And now, our final thing to take into consideration for preventing shin splints in terms of training, recovery, sleep. Sleep is when you actually recover. All the food you take in helps. Your training helps, but if you're not sleeping enough, you cannot recover optimally. The National Sleep Institute recommends 7 to 9 hours of continuous sleep. So I say, get 7 to 9 hours of continuous sleep. An easy way to get a little bit more sleep is set a bedtime and go to bed at the time that you have said you're going to go to bed. Don't sit there and scroll a little bit longer. Don't look up another thing. Try to get to bed before midnight, and then when your alarm goes off, get up when your alarm goes off. So over the course of this series, we've covered the anatomy, the causes of shin splints, commonly misdiagnosed medical issues, and now we've summed it all together in how to actually prevent them, rehab them, and defeat shin splints once and for all, so that you don't have to suffer from what is a preventable injury that we really shouldn't be getting. So these are the training, nutritional, and other considerations in how to not just prevent shin splints, but also to rehab them and stop them dead in their tracks before they become an injury that stops you from chasing after your goals and your dreams athletically or recreationally. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Coach Tony, Wrestling Putting Performance. Embrace your potential.